June 18th, 1815, 11:30 a.m., south of Brussels, Belgium. Through the acrid smoke drifting across the muddy slopes of Mont Saint-Jean, Sergeant James Graham of the 1st Foot Guards could see them coming. Thousands of them, the flower of French infantry, veterans of a dozen campaigns, marching in perfect formation toward his position. The 28-year-old Scotsman, who had survived 5 years of fighting across the Iberian Peninsula, checked his Brown Bess musket one final time and glanced down the line at his comrades. 2 ranks deep, standing shoulder to shoulder in their red coats, they waited with the disciplined patience that had made British infantry legendary. To the French columns advancing up the slope, these thin red lines must have seemed almost pathetic. A few hundred men spread across hundreds of yards, their formation so shallow it appeared to have no depth at all. French doctrine, proven successful across Europe for 2 decades, dictated that dense columns of determined infantry could smash through any linear formation through sheer momentum and mass. What the French didn't know, what they were about to discover in the most brutal way possible, was that British infantry had developed a tactical system specifically designed to destroy columnar attacks. Within minutes, the mathematical precision of British firepower would transform those triumphant French columns into broken masses of dying men. This is the story of how linear infantry tactics, disciplined volleys, and industrial-scale musketry stopped Napoleon Bonaparte's last bid for European domination. The thin red line that would decide the fate of Europe at Waterloo was the product of decades of tactical evolution. While continental armies had embraced dense columns as the solution to battlefield control, the British Army had taken a radically different approach based on firepower rather than shock. The doctrinal divergence began during the 7 Years' War when British commanders observed that their disciplined infantry could deliver devastating volleys that continental armies simply couldn't match. By the Napoleonic Wars, this had evolved into a comprehensive tactical system that made British line infantry the most lethal force on any battlefield. The foundation of British tactical superiority was their 2-rank formation. While French infantry advanced in columns 6 to 9 ranks deep, British infantry deployed in just 2 ranks, maximising the number of muskets that could fire simultaneously. This seemingly suicidal deployment was made possible by one factor that British training emphasised above all others: disciplined fire control. Every British infantryman spent hundreds of hours practising loading and firing until it became mechanical, until he could perform the 15 separate motions required to load and fire a Brown Bess musket, while standing in line under enemy fire without conscious thought. The Brown Bess itself was not a particularly advanced weapon. The Longland, pattern musket, which would dominate British infantry ranks at Waterloo, was a smoothbore flintlock that had been in service since 1722. It fired a 3/4-inch lead ball weighing roughly 1 ounce, with an effective range of perhaps 100 yards in the hands of an average soldier. The weapon was inaccurate, with studies showing that even practiced soldiers could only expect to hit a man-sized target at 80 yards about 50% of the time. Individual marksmanship was essentially irrelevant. What mattered was concentrated volley fire delivered by hundreds of muskets simultaneously. British infantry training focused obsessively on rate of fire and fire discipline. A well-trained British infantryman could load and fire 4 rounds per minute, significantly faster than his French counterpart. This wasn't achieved through superior weapons, but through endless drill. The loading sequence had been refined to eliminate every unnecessary motion, every wasted second. Remove cartridge from pouch, bite off the paper end, prime the pan, close the frizzen, pour powder down the barrel, insert ball and wadding, draw ramrod, ram the charge home, return ramrod, cock the hammer, shoulder the weapon, aim, fire. 15 motions performed in 15 seconds, 4 times per minute, for as long as ammunition and nerve held out. But speed of fire meant nothing without discipline. The key to British tactical success was controlled volleys, coordinated fire that concentrated hundreds of musket balls into a killing zone at precisely the right moment. This required soldiers who could stand in ranks under fire, loading and firing on command, holding their shots until ordered to fire regardless of what was happening around them. British sergeants with spontoons, half-pikes carried as symbols of authority, walked behind the ranks during combat, their job to keep the men steady, to ensure that no one fired out of turn, that volleys remained coordinated and devastating. The tactical manual governing British infantry operations was based on Sir David Dundas's rules and regulations for the movements of His Majesty's infantry, refined through years of Peninsular War combat. The standard British battalion at Waterloo consisted of 10 companies, each nominally containing 100 men, though combat attrition meant most were significantly under strength. 8 of these were centre companies of line infantry. The remaining 2 were flank companies, the Grenadiers and light infantry. Theoretically elite troops, though, by 1815, this distinction had become largely administrative. When deployed for combat, a British battalion would form in 2 ranks, the front rank kneeling or standing depending on the tactical situation, the rear rank standing. This created a formation roughly 200 yards wide and just 2 men deep for a full-strength battalion. To anyone accustomed to the dense columns favoured by French doctrine, this formation looked impossibly fragile, a line of men so thin it seemed a determined charge could punch through anywhere. That perception was exactly what British commanders wanted their enemies to believe. The vulnerability of the 2-rank line was mitigated by several factors. British battalions never deployed in isolation. They were positioned with other battalions to left and right, creating an overlapping field of fire. They were supported by artillery positioned in the intervals between battalions. They were backed by formed squares of reserve infantry positioned 200 to 300 yards to the rear, ready to move forward if the line was broken. Most importantly, they were trained to deliver fire in patterns specifically designed to destroy attacking columns. There were 3 primary firing patterns used by British infantry, each suited to different tactical situations. Company volleys involved each company firing independently in sequence from right to left down the battalion line, creating a rolling fire that maintained constant pressure. File firing had individual soldiers firing independently once they had loaded, creating sustained but less coordinated fire. But the most devastating pattern, the one that would break French columns at Waterloo, was the battalion volley, where the entire battalion fired simultaneously on command, concentrating 500 to 600 musket balls into the target area in an instant. The mathematics of this firepower were brutal. A French column advancing in standard order mixed formation, which combined deployed companies with closed companies, might present a frontage of 60 to 90 men across a width of perhaps 40 yards. A British battalion in 2-rank line extended across 200 yards, meaning that 3 British battalions could overlap and engage a single French column simultaneously. If all 3 battalions delivered a coordinated volley at 100 yards range, they would send between 1,500 and 800 musket balls into a target area 40 yards wide and perhaps 30 yards deep. Even accounting for the Brown Bess's notorious inaccuracy, a significant percentage of those balls would find targets. A French column receiving such a volley could expect to lose 20 to 30% of its front ranks in a single discharge. But one volley was rarely enough. The key to British success was delivering multiple volleys into attacking columns before they could close. If British infantry could fire 4 times per minute, and if they opened fire at 100 yards against columns advancing at typical infantry speed of perhaps 75 to 100 yards per minute, they could deliver 3 to 4 volleys before the column reached contact. Each volley would strip away more of the column's front ranks, disorganizing the formation, killing officers and sergeants, destroying the cohesion necessary for a successful assault. By the time the column reached British lines, if it reached them at all, its front ranks would be in chaos, men climbing over the bodies of their fallen comrades, the tight formation that gave columns their psychological advantage dissolving into a confused mass. The British had refined this system through years of combat in the Peninsular War against French armies. Battle after battle had proven the same pattern. French columns would advance with determination and courage, drums beating, officers shouting encouragement. British infantry would wait in their thin lines, seemingly vulnerable, holding fire until the columns were at effective range. Then the volleys would begin, precise, coordinated, devastating. Within minutes, French columns would recoil, their front ranks torn apart, survivors streaming back down the slope leaving hundreds of bodies behind. French generals attributed these defeats to British musketry being somehow superior, to British soldiers being better marksmen. They missed the point entirely. British soldiers weren't better shots. They were better at delivering coordinated firepower through superior discipline and training. By June 1815, British infantry had developed an almost contemptuous confidence in their tactical system. They had broken French columns at Busaco, Fuentes de Oñoro, Salamanca, Vitoria, and a dozen other peninsular battles. They knew that if they could maintain their formation, maintain their fire discipline, they could stop any columnar assault. But at Waterloo they would face a test beyond anything they had experienced. Napoleon Bonaparte, the master of European warfare, would throw the finest infantry in the French army against their lines in a series of assaults that would push British discipline to its absolute limits. The battlefield of Waterloo was a gently rolling landscape of farmland south of Brussels, centred on a low ridge called Mont Saint-Jean. The Duke of Wellington, commanding the Allied army, had positioned his forces along this ridge, using the reverse slope to protect his infantry from French artillery fire. The British and their allies occupied a front of roughly 2.5 miles, with key strong points at the Chateau of Hougoumont on the right, the farmhouse of La Haye-Sainte in the centre, and the village of Papelotte on the left. Between these strong points, Wellington deployed his infantry in the thin two-rank lines that had served him so well in Spain. The morning of June 18th had been miserable. Heavy rain the previous day had turned the battlefield into a muddy morass. British infantry, many of whom had spent the night in the open with no shelter, were cold, wet, and exhausted before the battle even began. They stood to arms at dawn, knowing that somewhere beyond the morning mist Napoleon's army was preparing to attack. Many of these men were peninsular veterans who had faced French infantry before. Others were recent recruits or soldiers from German states allied with Britain, less experienced but trained in British methods. All of them knew their lives would depend on their ability to stand in line and deliver controlled volleys, while French columns tried to kill them. Napoleon's plan for Waterloo was characteristically aggressive. He would pin Wellington's forces with a diversionary attack on Hougoumont, then smash through the Allied centre with massive infantry assaults supported by artillery bombardment. The Emperor believed, as he had always believed, that determined French infantry advancing in columns could break any defence through sheer elan and revolutionary fervour. He had seen it work across Europe for 20 years. He expected it to work again. What Napoleon failed to appreciate was that Wellington's army was not a typical continental force. It was built around a corps of British infantry battalions that had perfected the art of destroying columnar attacks. The battle began around 11:30 a.m. with a French diversionary assault on Hougoumont that would escalate into a day-long struggle, consuming thousands of troops on both sides. But the critical moment, the test of British linear tactics, came shortly after 1 p.m. when Napoleon launched his main assault. D'Erlon's corps, 4 divisions totalling approximately 16,000 infantry, formed up in the valley below Mont Saint-Jean and began their advance toward the British centre. This was not a typical French column attack. D'Erlon had organised his divisions in massive formations over 200 men wide and 24 to 27 ranks deep, essentially giant rectangles of infantry that would present maximum shock impact. These formations had succeeded against other European armies. Against British line infantry, they were about to become killing grounds. The French advance began with drums beating the pas de charge, that distinctive rhythm that had accompanied French infantry to victory across Europe. Officers led from the front, swords drawn, shouting "Vive l'Empereur!" The ranks chanted in response, their voices carrying across the valley. To Wellington's soldiers watching from the ridge, it must have been an awe-inspiring and terrifying sight. Thousands of blue-coated infantry advancing in perfect alignment, their formations so large and dense they seemed unstoppable. British artillery opened fire immediately, solid shot tearing lanes through the French ranks, but the formations closed up and continued advancing, climbing the muddy slope toward the ridge where British infantry waited. Wellington had positioned his infantry behind the ridge crest, invisible to the advancing French. As D'Erlon's massive columns neared the top of the slope, Wellington's infantry stood from their positions and advanced to the ridgeline, forming their 2-rank lines precisely as they had drilled thousands of times. The French, expecting to find scattered defenders or perhaps artillery positions, found instead long lines of red-coated infantry extending far beyond their column's flanks, muskets levelled and ready. What happened next was the vindication of everything British infantry training emphasised. The brigade commanders, men like General Picton and General Kempt, gave the order that their soldiers had heard countless times in drill and battle: make ready, present, fire. Along hundreds of yards of ridgeline, over 1,000 muskets discharged simultaneously. the front ranks of the nearest French column simply collapsed, dozens of men falling as if scythed. Before the smoke had cleared, British infantry were already reloading with the mechanical precision that endless drill had burned into muscle memory. 15 seconds later, a second volley crashed out, then a third, then a fourth. Private Thomas Plunkett of the 1st Battalion, 95th Rifles, positioned on the left of the British line, later recalled the effect of British volleys on the French columns. They came on with great determination. We could see their officers urging them forward. When our line fired the first volley, their front ranks seemed to simply disappear into the smoke. When the smoke cleared, we could see the dead and wounded piled up, but they kept coming, climbing over their own casualties. The second volley stopped them. The third volley broke them. They couldn't advance further, couldn't return effective fire because only their front ranks could use their muskets, while all our men could fire. They just stood there, dying. This was the fundamental flaw of columnar tactics when facing disciplined line infantry. A French column 40 yards wide and 27 ranks deep contained over 1,000 men, but only the front two ranks, perhaps 60 men, could effectively fire their muskets at any given time. The men behind them were essentially deadweight in terms of firepower, able to contribute only their physical presence and moral support. A British battalion in two-rank line extending 200 yards could bring 400 to 500 muskets to bear simultaneously. When multiple British battalions overlapped their fire against a single column, the firepower disparity became catastrophic. The French might have numerical superiority in total numbers, but at the point of contact they were massively outgunned. The British firing drill at Waterloo demonstrated the years of training British infantry received. Loading a Brown Bess musket while standing in formation under fire required both physical skill and extraordinary mental discipline. The soldier had to perform each of the 15 loading motions correctly, in sequence, without thinking about the men dying around him, without flinching from incoming fire, without succumbing to the overwhelming urge to run. British sergeants and officers, positioned behind and between the ranks, maintained this discipline through a combination of leadership, threats, and physical force. Men who broke ranks or fired without orders could expect a spontoon butt or sword, flat to encourage compliance. The coordinated volleys that broke D'Erlon's columns were possible only because British soldiers could suppress their natural instincts and fight as a machine. When French columns first came into range, the natural human impulse was to fire immediately, to do something, anything, to stop the threat advancing toward you. But British training emphasized holding fire until ordered, waiting for the moment of maximum effectiveness. Sergeants walked the ranks calling out, "Steady, steady," while officers calculated ranges and angles. Only when the French columns were at optimum range, close enough that British musket fire would be devastating, but far enough that the column couldn't immediately close, did the order to fire come. The volleys themselves had to be precisely coordinated. If soldiers fired individually or by small groups, their fire would be scattered and less effective. The shock effect of hundreds of muskets discharging simultaneously was both physical and psychological. The noise alone was stunning, a concussion that could be felt in the chest from hundreds of yards away. The smoke created instant concealment and confusion. Most importantly, the concentration of musket balls in a small area at the same instant meant that the target, the front ranks of the French column, received overwhelming fire before they could react. Men fell in clumps rather than individually, and the sight of dozens of comrades dropping simultaneously was more psychologically devastating than seeing them fall one by one. After each volley, British infantry immediately began reloading. This was where rate of fire became critical. French columns, stunned by the initial volleys but still advancing, needed to close the distance before British infantry could reload and fire again. If they could reach British lines while the British were reloading, they might achieve the shock impact that columnar tactics promised. But British loading drills, practiced until they became instinctive, were fast enough to reload and fire again before French columns could cover the remaining distance. The mathematics worked in Britain's favour. At 100 yards range, firing 4 times per minute, British infantry could deliver 3 volleys before a column advancing at 75 yards per minute could close. Each volley stripped away more of the column's front ranks, slowed its advance, destroyed its cohesion. The breaking of D'Erlon's columns on June 18th followed this pattern exactly. the massive French formations climbed the slope toward the ridge, believing their size and momentum would overwhelm any defence. British infantry stepped forward to the ridgeline and delivered volley after volley into the French front ranks, at ranges where musket fire was most effective. The French formations, unable to return effective fire because only their front ranks could engage while packed in dense columns, absorbed horrific casualties. Men in the rear ranks, unable to see what was happening at the front, continued pushing forward, literally climbing over the bodies of dead and wounded comrades. The front ranks, being systematically destroyed by British musketry, tried to return fire but were outgunned 5 or 6 to 1. Within minutes, the French columns stalled. They couldn't advance against the weight of British fire, couldn't effectively return fire because of their own formation, couldn't maintain cohesion as their officers and sergeants fell. The tight formation that was supposed to be their strength became a trap. Men couldn't maneuver individually, couldn't take cover, couldn't even see the enemy through their own front ranks and the dense smoke. They could only stand in their packed formations and die, while British volleys poured into them. General Picton's division, positioned in the centre of Wellington's line, bore the brunt of Durland's assault. Picton himself was killed early in the action, shot through the head by a French musket ball, but his division held firm. The 28th Regiment of Foot, the 32nd Regiment, the 79th Cameron Highlanders all stood in their two-rank lines and delivered systematic volleys into the French columns advancing toward them. The Highlanders, in particular, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Neil Douglas, demonstrated the disciplined fire control that made British tactics work. As a French column climbed toward their position, Douglas held his men's fire until the French were within 60 yards. Then he gave the order for a general volley. The entire regiment, nearly 500 men, fired simultaneously. The front ranks of the French column were shattered, men falling in heaps. Before the French could recover, the Highlanders had reloaded and fired again. A third volley followed, then a fourth. The French column broke and streamed back down the slope, leaving hundreds of casualties behind. Private Donald MacLeod of the 79th later wrote in his journal, "The French came on bravely, we must give them that. Their officers were very gallant leading from the front, but they never had a chance against our fire. When Colonel Douglas gave the order to fire, the entire front rank of the French simply dropped. We reloaded and fired again, and more fell. By the third volley they were faltering. By the fourth they were running. We didn't charge after them. We didn't need to. Our muskets had done all the work necessary." The effectiveness of British musketry at Waterloo was enhanced by several factors specific to that battle. The muddy ground from the previous day's rain slowed French advances, giving British infantry more time to deliver volleys. The gentle slope of the ridge meant that British infantry positioned at the crest could fire down into advancing columns, making their volleys more effective. Wellington's use of the reverse slope protected British infantry from French artillery bombardment before the assault, meaning they entered combat relatively fresh rather than already shaken by hours of shelling. All these factors combined to create ideal conditions for British linear tactics to work exactly as designed. But the most important factor was simply British training and discipline. The men standing in those two-rank lines had been drilled relentlessly in loading and firing, in maintaining formation under fire, in following orders regardless of circumstances. When French columns advanced toward them, when cannons roared and musket balls buzzed past their heads, when comrades fell screaming beside them, British infantry did exactly what they had been trained to do. They stood in their ranks, loaded their muskets, waited for the order to fire, delivered coordinated volleys, and reloaded. Again and again and again. This mechanical precision, this ability to function as a firing machine rather than a collection of frightened individuals, was what broke French columns. The destruction of Durland's first assault was not the end of French efforts to break Wellington's centre. Throughout the afternoon, additional French infantry assaults battered against British lines. Each time the pattern repeated. French columns would advance with determination and courage. British infantry would wait in their thin lines. Volleys would crash out. French formations would stagger and break. The tactical system that British infantry had perfected over years of peninsular fighting proved as effective at Waterloo as it had at Salamanca or Vittoria. Around 4 p.m, Marshal Ney, commanding French forces in Napoleon's absence while the Emperor dealt with the Prussian threat on his right flank, observed Allied infantry appearing to retreat near the centre. Misinterpreting a repositioning movement, Ney ordered a massive cavalry assault against Wellington's centre, believing the Allied line was breaking. What followed was one of the most spectacular and futile actions in military history. Thousands of French cuirassiers and cavalry, some of the finest horsemen in Europe, charged up the slope toward British positions. Wellington's response demonstrated another aspect of British infantry tactical flexibility. The thin two-rank lines quickly formed squares, compact four-sided formations bristling with muskets that cavalry could not penetrate. But even before the squares formed, British infantry delivered devastating volley fire into the approaching cavalry. The same loading drills, the same fire discipline that broke French infantry columns, now tore into cavalry formations. Horses and riders fell in tangled masses. Those who reached British squares found themselves unable to break the steady wall of bayonets and musket fire. British infantry in square formation would fire by ranks, the front rank kneeling, delivering a volley into approaching cavalry at point-blank range. Then the second rank would fire while the first reloaded. This created a continuous fire that cavalry simply could not penetrate. French horsemen circled the squares, unable to close, being shot down systematically by disciplined musket fire. The repulse of the French cavalry charges again demonstrated that British infantry effectiveness came from training and discipline rather than superior weapons or tactics. The Brown Bess musket used by British infantry in 1815 was functionally identical to weapons used decades earlier. The two-rank line formation was not innovative. It had been used in various forms for over a century. What made British infantry special was their ability to execute basic drills under the most extreme combat stress, standing in square formation while cavalry thundered toward you, waiting for the order to fire, holding your shot until the horses were close enough that you could see the riders' faces, then delivering a coordinated volley required extraordinary discipline. British infantry possessed that discipline because they had trained for it relentlessly. As the afternoon wore on and French assaults continued, British infantry casualties mounted. Regiments that had started the day with 500 men were reduced to 300, then 200. Officers and sergeants fell, leaving junior ranks to maintain command. Ammunition began to run low, with soldiers searching the cartridge boxes of dead comrades to refill their own. The physical exhaustion of loading and firing muskets for hours in combat conditions was tremendous. Each shot produced brutal recoil that bruised shoulders. The flash from the priming pan burned faces. The constant exposure to powder smoke and noise left men deaf and disoriented. Yet British infantry maintained their formations and continued delivering volleys. Captain John Kincaid of the 95th Rifles, positioned on the left of Wellington's line, described the state of British infantry late in the battle. Men stood like automatons, loading and firing with mechanical precision because they were too exhausted to think. Officers shouted orders that could barely be heard over the continuous roar of musketry. The ground was carpeted with spent cartridges and littered with dead and wounded, yet the line held. Every time the French came forward, we fired. We didn't debate or discuss. We just fired. That's what we were trained to do, and we did it until we couldn't physically continue. The climax of the battle came around 7:00 p.m., when Napoleon committed his Imperial Guard, the elite veteran infantry he had held in reserve, to a final assault against Wellington's centre. These were not ordinary French infantry. They were the finest soldiers in Napoleon's army, men who had fought in dozens of campaigns, who had never been defeated. They advanced in column formation, drums beating, with the same confidence that had carried them to victory across Europe. Wellington's response was to deploy his most experienced units to receive them. The 1st Foot Guards, veterans of every major peninsular battle, stood in their two-rank line directly in the path of the Imperial Guard's advance. What happened next became legendary in British military history. As the Imperial Guard emerged from the smoke and climbed toward the ridgeline, they were met by the massed volleys of the 1st Foot Guards at extremely close range, perhaps 50 yards. The effect was catastrophic. The Imperial Guard's front ranks were swept away by the first volley. A second volley followed. Within seconds, then a third. The unstoppable Imperial Guard, Napoleon's finest troops, stopped. They tried to deploy from column into line to return more effective fire, a difficult manoeuvre under any circumstances and nearly impossible while under sustained musket fire. British infantry, sensing the moment, intensified their fire. More Imperial Guard soldiers fell. The formation wavered. Then, for the first time in their history, the Imperial Guard broke. They turned and fled down the slope, pursued by British volleys and cheers. The breaking of the Imperial Guard shattered French morale across the battlefield. If Napoleon's best troops couldn't break British lines, nothing could. The entire French army began to dissolve, retreating toward France in increasing disorder. Wellington ordered a general advance, and British infantry, exhausted but triumphant, moved forward from the ridge they had defended for 9 hours. The Battle of Waterloo was over. Napoleon's final bid to reclaim his empire had been stopped by the disciplined musketry of British line infantry. The butcher's bill from Waterloo was horrific. Wellington's army suffered approximately 15,000 casualties, including 8,000 British. Many of these were infantrymen who had stood in those thin red lines absorbing French attacks. But French casualties were far worse, over 25,000 killed and wounded, plus an additional 8,000 captured. A significant portion of these casualties came from British musket fire. The concentrated volleys that broke French columns didn't just stop attacks, they inflicted massive casualties on tightly packed formations that made excellent targets. Analysis of the battlefield after the fighting revealed the effectiveness of British firepower. In areas where French columns had assaulted British lines, the density of French casualties was extreme. Bodies were stacked 2 and 3 deep in some places, particularly at the points where columns had stalled under British volleys. Medical officers treating French wounded reported that many had multiple musket ball wounds, testament to the volume of fire British infantry had poured into attacking formations. The mathematical calculation was inescapable. British linear tactics, emphasizing disciplined volley fire over individual marksmanship, had proven decisively superior to French columnar tactics in direct combat. The question naturally arises, why didn't the French adapt? French commanders had faced British line infantry throughout the Peninsular War, losing battle after battle to superior British musketry. Why did they continue using columnar tactics that were so vulnerable to concentrated firepower? The answer lies partly in doctrine and partly in the nature of the French army. French revolutionary and Napoleonic tactical doctrine emphasized offensive spirit, elan, and momentum. Columns were seen as the physical manifestation of revolutionary fervour, dense masses of patriots overwhelming aristocratic enemies through determination and numbers. To abandon columnar tactics would be to abandon the ideological foundation of French military thinking. More practically, French infantry simply weren't trained to fight in line formation the way British infantry were. The French army had grown massively during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, incorporating conscripts who received minimal training before being sent to the front. These soldiers could learn to march in column and follow orders to advance. They couldn't be trained to the level of fire discipline and coordination that British line tactics required. British infantry were long-service professionals, or semi-professionals who had undergone extensive training. French infantry were often conscripts serving relatively short terms. The French used columns not because they were superior, but because columns were what French infantry could realistically execute. Additionally, French tactics had worked successfully against every other European army. Austrian, Prussian, Russian, and Italian armies had all been defeated by French columnar assaults. Only British infantry, with their distinctive 2-rank lines and emphasis on volley fire, had consistently stopped French columns. From Napoleon's perspective, changing his entire tactical system because of one recalcitrant enemy who represented a small portion of his opponents would have been illogical. Better to assume that British success came from unique circumstances or British advantages in terrain and position. This assumption was proven fatally wrong at Waterloo. The legacy of Waterloo and British linear tactics extended far beyond June 18th, 1815. The battle demonstrated conclusively that disciplined firepower could defeat mass and momentum, that training and coordination mattered more than revolutionary fervour or numerical advantage. For the British Army, Waterloo vindicated decades of tactical development and confirmed their infantry as the finest in the world. The thin red line became a symbol of British military power, a formation that would be employed throughout the 19th century in colonial conflicts around the globe. The tactical lessons from Waterloo influenced military thinking for decades. The importance of fire discipline of coordinated volleys over individual aimed fire remained central to British infantry doctrine well into the rifle era. Even when rifled muskets with much greater accuracy replaced smoothbore weapons in the 1850s and 1860s, British infantry retained the emphasis on volley fire and linear tactics that had served them so well at Waterloo. The assumption was that if coordinated volleys of inaccurate smoothbore muskets could break French columns, coordinated volleys of accurate rifles would be even more effective. This assumption would eventually prove problematic. By the late 19th century, the increasing lethality of firearms, the introduction of breech-loading rifles and machine guns made linear tactics increasingly suicidal. The thin red lines that had stopped French columns at Waterloo would be mowed down by Maxim guns in later conflicts. But at Waterloo, in 1815, with smoothbore muskets and Napoleonic-era tactics, the British system of linear infantry and disciplined volley fire represented the peak of effective infantry tactics. For the soldiers who stood in those two-rank lines on June 18, 1815, the battle was a test of everything they had trained for. Men like Sergeant James Graham, who had watched French columns climbing toward his position that morning, survived because of training that had taught him to stand in line and fire on command regardless of circumstances. The fact that he and thousands of others like him could maintain this discipline through 9 hours of continuous combat, while wounded comrades fell around them and French columns repeatedly advanced toward their positions, was the true miracle of Waterloo. The mathematics of Waterloo were brutal but simple. British infantry, deployed in two-rank lines, could bring more muskets to bear on target than French infantry in columns. British training emphasised rate of fire and fire discipline, allowing them to deliver coordinated volleys faster and more reliably than their opponents. British tactical doctrine positioned infantry to maximise overlapping fields of fire while using terrain for protection. All these factors combined to create a system where French columns, regardless of their size or determination, could not reach British lines without being torn apart by sustained musket fire. In the final analysis, Waterloo was won not by superior strategy or battlefield manoeuvre, though Wellington's tactical positioning was excellent, but by the ability of British infantry to stand in formation and shoot. The thin red line, that seemingly vulnerable two-rank formation that appeared almost comical in its shallowness, proved to be the most effective tactical formation on the battlefield. French columns, dense and impressive-looking, were simply targets for British musketry. The men who had laughed at British tactical deployments early in the Napoleonic Wars learned through brutal experience that 2 ranks of disciplined infantry with muskets were more effective than 9 ranks of enthusiastic troops advancing in column. The final French casualties at Waterloo included thousands killed by musket fire, men who died because they were packed into columns that made them easy targets for British volleys. Every French soldier who fell to British musketry was a testament to the effectiveness of training, discipline, and tactical doctrine. The British system worked not because British soldiers were individually superior, though their training was excellent, but because the system itself maximised effectiveness. 2 ranks instead of 9 meant maximum firepower. Volley fire instead of individual aimed fire meant concentrated effect. Fire discipline instead of independent firing meant coordinated shock. All these elements, practiced endlessly in drill and proven in peninsular battles, came together at Waterloo to stop Napoleon's last army. When the battle ended and British infantry finally advanced from their positions, they marched over ground carpeted with French casualties. The evidence of their musketry's effectiveness was visible everywhere, in the heaps of bodies where columns had stalled under British fire, in the trails of dead and wounded marking where broken formations had retreated, in the sheer density of casualties at points where British volleys had been most concentrated. British soldiers, exhausted and traumatised by the day's fighting, could take some grim satisfaction in knowing their training and discipline had proven decisive. The Battle of Waterloo ended Napoleon Bonaparte's political career and his threat to European stability. But more fundamentally, it validated a tactical system that the British Army had developed over decades of warfare. The thin red line, standing in 2 ranks and delivering disciplined volleys, had stopped the greatest military commander of the age. That achievement rested not on superior technology or overwhelming numbers, but on training, discipline, and a tactical doctrine that understood how to maximise the effectiveness of smoothbore muskets in the hands of well-drilled infantry. French columns had dominated European battlefields for 20 years. At Waterloo, British lines broke them definitively and finally. The age of column tactics was over, destroyed by the mathematical precision of British musketry and the courage of men who could stand in formation and fire while French veterans tried to kill them. The thunder of British volleys echoed across Europe as the sound of Napoleon's defeat, and the proof that disciplined firepower would always defeat mere mass and momentum. The human cost of developing and maintaining the tactical system that won at Waterloo deserves examination. The two-rank line and disciplined volley fire didn't emerge fully formed from British military thinking. They evolved through decades of brutal combat experience, paid for with the lives of soldiers who stood in formation while enemies shot at them. The system's effectiveness at Waterloo was the culmination of lessons learned in blood across multiple continents. British linear tactics traced their lineage to the 18th century wars that established Britain as a major European power. During the 7 Years' War from 1756 to 1763, British commanders fighting in Germany and North America discovered that their infantry could deliver more effective fire than their continental allies or enemies. This wasn't because British muskets were superior, they used the same basic smoothbore flintlock design as everyone else, but because British soldiers received more extensive training in loading and firing. While Prussian infantry drilled extensively in manoeuvre and formation changes, British drill sergeants obsessed over rate of fire. A Prussian infantryman might fire 2 rounds per minute with perfect reliability. A British infantryman was expected to fire 4. This emphasis on rate of fire had practical origins. Britain's relatively small population compared to continental powers meant British armies were always outnumbered. If you couldn't match enemy numbers, you needed to maximise the effectiveness of each soldier you had. Making individual soldiers shoot faster was one way to achieve this. But the real breakthrough came from combining rapid fire with coordinated volleys. 100 men firing individually at 4 rounds per minute produced continuous but scattered fire. 100 men firing simultaneously in coordinated volleys produced concentrated shock that was far more effective at breaking enemy formations. The American Revolutionary War from 1775 to 1783 provided harsh lessons that refined British tactics further. American riflemen, using long rifles far more accurate than British muskets, inflicted heavy casualties on British infantry, who fought in the traditional close-order formations of European warfare. British commanders learned that while linear tactics worked well on open European battlefields, they needed modification for different terrain and different enemies. The solution wasn't to abandon lines for other formations, but to add light infantry companies that could fight in looser formations while maintaining the line infantry battalions as the army's backbone. This created tactical flexibility while preserving the devastating volley fire that made British infantry effective. By the time war with revolutionary France began in 1793, British infantry tactics had evolved into a sophisticated system. The standard battalion organisation included 8 line companies for formal combat and 2 flank companies, grenadiers and light infantry, for specialised roles. In theory, grenadiers were elite assault troops while light infantry were skirmishers. In practice by 1815, these distinctions had blurred, but the organisational structure remained. What mattered was that every British infantry battalion was organised, trained and equipped to fight in 2-rank lines, delivering coordinated volley fire. The early campaigns of the French Revolutionary Wars were disasters for British arms. Expeditions to Flanders in 1793-1795 ended in defeat and evacuation. British forces were too small, too poorly supported, and too badly coordinated with their Austrian and Dutch allies to stop French armies. But these defeats taught valuable lessons. British commanders observed that French infantry advancing in columns could overwhelm other European armies but struggled against disciplined fire. The challenge was maintaining that discipline when outnumbered, under artillery bombardment and facing determined assaults. The solution was better training and more realistic drill that prepared soldiers for actual combat conditions. Lieutenant General Sir John Moore, commanding the British Light Infantry Training Depot at Shorncliffe from 1803, revolutionised British infantry training. Moore believed that soldiers needed to understand why they were performing drill movements, not just execute them mechanically. His training emphasised initiative within a framework of discipline. Soldiers learned to think while fighting, to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining their formation and fire discipline. Moore's methods spread throughout the British Army, creating infantrymen who were not just well-drilled automatons but thinking soldiers who understood their tactical role. The Peninsular War from 1808 to 1814 was where British linear tactics were refined into the system that would win at Waterloo. Fighting in Spain and Portugal against French armies, British infantry under Wellington's command faced French columns repeatedly. Each battle provided data on what worked and what didn't. Wellington discovered that British infantry needed to be positioned carefully to maximise their advantage. Placing them on reverse slopes protected them from artillery fire, while allowing them to move forward to the crest when French columns approached. Positioning battalions to overlap fields of fire meant multiple battalions could engage each attacking column. Supporting lines with artillery in the intervals between battalions provided additional firepower and backup if infantry lines were penetrated. The Battle of Busaco on September 27, 1810, demonstrated these tactics perfectly. French forces under Marshal Massena attacked British and Portuguese positions on a ridge. Wellington deployed his infantry on the reverse slope invisible to the French. When French columns reached the ridge crest, exhausted from climbing the steep slope, they were met by British infantry who had moved up to the military crest and formed their two-rank lines. Coordinated volleys fired at close range devastated the French front ranks. Additional British battalions overlapped fire from the flanks. Within minutes, French columns broke and retreated down the slope, leaving hundreds of casualties behind. The pattern would repeat at Fuentes de Oñoro, Albuera, Salamanca and Vitoria. French columns climbed toward British positions. British infantry waited in line. Volleys crashed out. French formations broke. What made these victories possible was not just tactical doctrine, but the quality of British soldiers. By 1810, British infantry in the peninsula were veterans who had complete confidence in their tactical system. They had seen French columns broken repeatedly by their musket fire. They knew that if they maintained formation and fire discipline, they would win. This psychological confidence was as important as their physical training. Men who believed in their tactics would stand firm under pressure. Men who doubted would break and run. British infantry in the peninsula had no doubts. The training that created this confidence was brutal and repetitive. Soldiers spent hours every day drilling, practicing the loading motions until they became automatic. Remove cartridge, bite off paper end, prime the pan, close the frizzen, pour powder, insert ball, draw ramrod, ram charge, return ramrod, cock hammer, shoulder weapon, aim, fire. 15 motions, 15 seconds, 4 times per minute, day after day, week after week, until soldiers could perform the sequence while exhausted, while under fire, while watching comrades die beside them. The psychological conditioning was as important as the physical skill. Drill taught soldiers to obey orders instantly without thinking. When a sergeant shouted, "Make ready," hundreds of soldiers responded identically. When an officer commanded "present," muskets came up to shoulders in unison. When the order "fire" came, triggers were pulled simultaneously. This instant obedience to commands was what made coordinated volleys possible. British soldiers also learned when not to fire, which was equally important. The natural human response when being shot at is to return fire immediately, to do something to fight back. But firing at the wrong moment, before the enemy was at effective range or before your comrades were ready, wasted ammunition and reduced effectiveness. British drill sergeants beat this instinct out of their soldiers, literally when necessary. Men who fired without orders could expect physical punishment. The message was clear. You fire when ordered, not before, not after, exactly when commanded. This iron discipline was what allowed British infantry to hold their fire, while French columns climbed toward them, waiting until the moment of maximum effectiveness before unleashing their volleys. The psychological pressure of standing in line under fire while waiting for the order to shoot was enormous. Men could see the enemy approaching, could see the musket flashes and cannon fire aimed at them, could hear the buzz of passing bullets and see comrades falling. Every instinct screamed to fire, to run, to do something other than just stand there. Overcoming these instincts required both training and leadership. British officers and sergeants positioned themselves where soldiers could see them, providing visible examples of calm under fire. If the officers stood steady, soldiers could convince themselves to stand steady as well. If the officers showed fear or hesitation, formations would collapse. The Battle of Albuera on May 16, 1811, demonstrated both the strength and fragility of British linear tactics. French forces under Marshal Soult attacked an Anglo-Portuguese Spanish army commanded by Marshal Beresford. The battle initially went badly for the Allies. Spanish infantry, unfamiliar with British tactical methods, were overrun by French cavalry and columns. British infantry under General Lowry Cole advanced to stabilise the situation, but were caught in the open by French cavalry. Several battalions were forced to form square quickly, taking heavy casualties in the process, but, once formed and properly positioned, British infantry demonstrated their characteristic effectiveness. The Fusilier Brigade, 3 battalions in line, engaged French columns at close range. The volleys were devastating. French infantry, veterans of multiple campaigns, were stopped and broken by concentrated British musketry. Albuera was one of the bloodiest battles of the Peninsular War, with the Fusilier Brigade suffering nearly 50% casualties, but British firepower had once again proved decisive. Albuera taught important lessons about the conditions necessary for British tactics to work. Infantry needed time to form properly. They needed protection from cavalry, either from their own cavalry or by forming square. They needed clear fields of fire and sufficient ammunition. When these conditions were met, British infantry were devastating. When they weren't, British infantry were vulnerable. Wellington absorbed these lessons and applied them in subsequent battles, always positioning his infantry to maximise their advantages while minimising their vulnerabilities. The most impressive demonstration of British linear tactics before Waterloo came at Salamanca on July 22, 1812. Wellington's army, which had been retreating, turned and attacked when French Marshal Marmont overextended his forces. British infantry advanced in line against French positions, their formations maintained despite moving across broken ground. When they contacted French forces, the pattern repeated. British lines delivered coordinated volleys that tore apart French formations. The Battle of Salamanca was unusual because British infantry attacked rather than defending, but the fundamental tactic remained unchanged. British lines with their superior firepower destroyed French columns. Wellington later called Salamanca his finest battle, and French casualties, over 14,000 compared to British losses of 5,000, testified to the effectiveness of British musketry even in offensive operations. By 1813, French commanders in Spain were actively avoiding direct infantry combat with British forces. They had learned through repeated defeats that their columns couldn't break British lines. French strategy shifted to trying to manoeuvre Wellington into untenable positions, or attacking his Portuguese and Spanish allies who were less effective in direct combat. This strategic shift was an acknowledgement that French tactical doctrine had no answer to British firepower. The revolutionary fervour and offensive spirit that had swept French armies to victory across Europe foundered against the disciplined volleys of British infantry. The training pipeline that produced these effective soldiers was itself a marvel of organisation. Recruits enlisted or were pressed into service and sent to regimental depots where they underwent basic training. This training lasted several months and was physically and psychologically demanding. Recruits learned to march in step, to maintain formation, to respond instantly to commands. They practiced loading and firing until the motions became automatic. They were subjected to harsh discipline that broke down civilian habits and rebuilt them as soldiers who would obey without question. The training was not designed to create independent thinkers, but disciplined components of a larger machine. Individual initiative was less important than the ability to function as part of a coordinated whole. After basic training, soldiers joined their battalions and continued training under regimental sergeants. Here they learned the specific drills and standards of their particular regiment. Some regiments had reputations for exceptional discipline and effectiveness. The 1st Foot Guards, the regiment that would break the Imperial Guard at Waterloo, were known for immaculate drill and absolute reliability under fire. Other regiments were less prestigious, but equally effective when properly led. The key was continuous training that maintained skills and discipline. Even veteran units in the peninsula spent time drilling when not actively campaigning. Skills degraded without practice, and the complex coordinated volleys that made British infantry effective required constant maintenance. Officers received different training but learned the same essential lessons. British officers in the Napoleonic era purchased their commissions, a system that seems absurd to modern sensibilities, but had some practical advantages. Officers who had paid for their positions had financial incentive not to waste them through incompetence. More importantly, the purchase system allowed Wellington to remove ineffective officers by refusing to approve their promotion purchases. Officers learned tactics partly through formal study, but mostly through experience. junior officers served under experienced commanders and learned by observation and participation. The best officers understood that their role in combat was to maintain order and morale, to keep their men in formation and firing when every instinct told those men to run. The logistical system supporting British infantry was equally important to their effectiveness. Soldiers needed steady supplies of ammunition, food, and equipment to maintain their combat effectiveness. The Board of Ordnance, responsible for supplying British forces, had developed efficient systems for manufacturing and distributing ammunition. Cartridges for the Brown Bess musket were manufactured in Britain and shipped to the peninsula in sealed containers. Each cartridge contained precise amounts of powder and a lead ball wrapped in paper. The quality control was generally good, ensuring that British muskets functioned reliably. French forces, fighting in enemy territory and often living off the land, had less reliable logistics. French soldiers might find their ammunition didn't fit their weapons properly, or that powder quality varied. British soldiers could generally rely on their cartridges working as intended. The actual experience of standing in a two-rank line and delivering volleys under combat conditions was traumatic, beyond what modern sensibilities can easily grasp. The noise was overwhelming. A battalion volley, 400 to 500 muskets firing simultaneously, produced a concussion that could be felt physically. The smoke from black powder weapons was thick and acrid, reducing visibility to a few yards within seconds. Soldiers fired into smoke at targets they often couldn't clearly see, relying on their officers to tell them where to aim. The physical shock of musket fire, the recoil slamming into shoulders, the flash from the priming pan inches from faces, the burning powder specks hitting exposed skin, all combined to make firing a Brown Bess musket an assault on the senses. The psychological impact of combat was equally severe. Men watched comrades die beside them, often messily. A musket ball could shatter bone and tear flesh in gruesome ways. Artillery fire was even worse, solid shot decapitating multiple men in a file, or canister rounds shredding bodies. Medical care was primitive. Wounded men could expect amputation without anaesthesia if they had limb injuries or no effective treatment at all for body wounds. Soldiers knew that being hit might mean lingering death from infection or crippling injury that would leave them begging on streets after the war. Yet they had to stand in formation, exposed to fire, following orders to hold position, and fire on command. The courage required to maintain this discipline was extraordinary. British infantry developed coping mechanisms for combat stress. Dark humour was universal. Soldiers joked about death, about fear, about their officers, about anything that helped maintain psychological distance from the horror around them. Alcohol helped when available. British soldiers drank heavily when they could access liquor, partly for enjoyment but partly to numb themselves to their circumstances. Religious faith sustained some soldiers. Others relied on camaraderie, fighting not for abstract concepts like king and country, but for the men standing beside them in the line. Letting down your comrades was more terrifying than facing enemy fire. This bond between soldiers was deliberately cultivated by the regimental system. Men served in the same battalion for years, knowing their comrades intimately. This created powerful social pressure to maintain standards. Running away meant betraying men you had trained with, marched with, suffered with. Most soldiers would rather die than face that shame. The dark side of British military discipline also needs acknowledgement. The British Army maintained order through harsh corporal punishment. Flogging with the cat-o'-nine tails was standard punishment for infractions ranging from drunkenness to insubordination. Soldiers could receive dozens or even hundreds of lashes for serious offences. Desertion in the face of the enemy could result in execution by firing squad. This brutal discipline was considered necessary to maintain the iron control needed for linear tactics to work. Officers believed that soldiers, many of whom were from the poorest classes of society, would not stand and fight without the threat of severe punishment. Whether this belief was accurate is debatable, but it shaped British military culture throughout the Napoleonic Wars. The effectiveness of British linear tactics was also influenced by factors beyond pure infantry capability. British artillery, while numerically inferior to French artillery in most battles, was well trained and effectively employed. Wellington positioned his guns to support infantry formations, firing canister at attacking columns to disrupt them before they reached British lines. British cavalry, though often criticised for lack of discipline, provided crucial support by screening infantry deployments and exploiting opportunities when French formations broke. The combined arms approach, integrating infantry, artillery and cavalry, made British forces more effective than infantry alone could have been. The social composition of British forces also mattered. British infantry were largely drawn from the working class, men who enlisted because they had few other options. Wellington famously called them the scum of the earth, though he also acknowledged they were fine fellows when properly trained and led. These men were not fighting for revolutionary ideals or national liberation. They fought for pay, for comradeship, for regimental pride, and because the alternative to following orders was severe punishment. This might seem like a weak foundation for military effectiveness, but it created soldiers who were remarkably steady under fire. They had no illusions about the glory of war. They knew it was miserable, dangerous work. But it was their job, and they did it with professional competence. The contrast with French infantry was stark. French soldiers in 1815 included many veterans of earlier campaigns, but also numerous conscripts with limited training. French revolutionary ideology had initially created motivated soldiers fighting for their new republic. By 1815, after years of constant warfare and Napoleon's transformation from revolutionary leader to emperor, much of that ideological motivation had faded. French soldiers still fought effectively, but they were not the ideologically driven revolutionaries of 1793. They were war-weary men who wanted the wars to end. British soldiers were also tired of war, but they had professional pride in their competence. Doing their job well, standing in line and firing on command, was a source of identity, even when they hated the circumstances. The role of junior officers and sergeants in maintaining British effectiveness cannot be overstated. These were the men who directly supervised soldiers in combat, who enforced discipline, who provided immediate leadership when situations changed rapidly. A good sergeant was worth his weight in gold. He knew every man in his company, understood their strengths and weaknesses, could identify who was about to break and needed encouragement or threats to stay in line. He was the immediate enforcer of discipline, using his spontoon to threaten or strike men who hesitated. He was also often the steadying presence that kept men calm. Sergeants were usually promoted from the ranks, soldiers who had proven themselves reliable and competent. They had credibility with common soldiers that commissioned officers often lacked. Junior officers, lieutenants and captains provided tactical leadership at the company level. They made immediate decisions about when to fire, where to position their men, how to respond to changing situations. Good junior officers understood their soldiers and knew how to motivate them. They led from the front, exposing themselves to the same dangers as their men, which created respect and loyalty. Bad junior officers who stayed safely behind the lines or showed cowardice lost their men's respect, and their companies became less effective. The British system allowed some flexibility for junior officers to exercise judgment within the framework of overall orders. This was crucial because battlefield conditions were chaotic and situations changed rapidly. Junior officers who could think independently while still following the overall tactical plan made British forces more adaptable. The medical care available to British soldiers deserves mention because it influenced their willingness to fight. Wounded British soldiers could expect to be evacuated from the battlefield and treated by military surgeons. The treatment was primitive by modern standards, but it was systematic and relatively organised. Soldiers knew that if they were wounded, their army would attempt to care for them. This was not a guarantee. Medical services were overwhelmed after major battles, but it was better than nothing. French soldiers in 1815 had less confidence in their medical support. The French medical service had been excellent earlier in the Napoleonic Wars, but had degraded by 1815 due to resource shortages. British soldiers could at least hope that being wounded would not mean abandonment. This psychological factor helped men stand in line under fire. The ammunition expenditure during major battles was enormous and speaks to the intensity of musket fire that British infantry delivered. At Waterloo, British infantry fired millions of rounds over the course of the battle. Each soldier carried 60 rounds in his cartridge box at the start of battle. Many expended all of this ammunition and had to be resupplied from ammunition wagons or scavenged cartridges from casualties. The rate of fire British infantry maintained, 4 rounds per minute sustained over hours, was only possible because of the logistics system that kept ammunition flowing forward. French columns that attacked British lines were advancing into a storm of lead that never seemed to slacken. The psychological impact of continuous heavy fire was as important as the physical casualties it inflicted. The sound of British musketry was distinctive and became feared by French soldiers. The coordinated battalion volleys produced a sound like thunder, a single massive crack followed by the rattle of individual shots, as soldiers loaded and fired at slightly different rates. French soldiers learned to recognize this sound and knew it meant British infantry were delivering their characteristic disciplined fire. The fear this sound induced was not irrational panic, but rational recognition of danger. Men who heard British volleys knew that casualties would be heavy, and that advancing further meant walking into sustained, accurate fire. The psychological effect of distinctive weaponry sounds has been noted throughout military history. In the Napoleonic era, the thunder of British volleys was the audio signature of their tactical effectiveness. The physical layout of the Waterloo battlefield influenced how effectively British linear tactics could be employed. The ridge of Mont Saint-Jean provided a natural defensive position that Wellington exploited perfectly. The gentle slope meant attacking French forces had to climb, while British infantry, positioned on or just behind the crest, could fire from a stable position. The mud from the previous day's rain slowed French advances, giving British infantry more time to deliver volleys. The distance from the valley floor to the British positions was just far enough that French columns were winded from the climb when they came into contact with British lines. All these factors combined to create ideal conditions for British defensive firepower to work as designed. Wellington's command decisions on the day of battle demonstrated his understanding of how to maximise British infantry effectiveness. He positioned his forces on the reverse slope to protect them from French artillery, only moving them forward to the crest when French infantry approached. He carefully managed his reserves, reinforcing threatened sectors without depleting his forces elsewhere. He integrated his artillery to support infantry, positioning guns to fire canister into French columns as they approached British lines. He used his cavalry conservatively, keeping them available to exploit opportunities or cover infantry if lines were broken. All of these decisions reflected deep understanding of his infantry's capabilities and limitations. British line infantry were devastating when properly employed but vulnerable if misused. Wellington never misused them. The final French assault of the battle, the Imperial Guard attack around 7 p.m, represented Napoleon's last throw of the dice. The Imperial Guard were his finest troops, men who had earned their places in the elite formation through years of service and demonstrated courage. Napoleon committed them to a final assault, believing that their reputation and fighting quality would succeed where other troops had failed. But tactical quality cannot overcome fundamental disadvantages. The Imperial Guard advanced in columns like every other French infantry unit. They climbed the same muddy slope, faced the same British defensive positions, and encountered the same disciplined volleys that had broken earlier assaults. Their reputation and courage meant they advanced further and endured more punishment before breaking. But the outcome was predetermined by tactics. Columns could not break lines when those lines could deliver overwhelming firepower. The moment when the Imperial Guard broke and retreated was the psychological turning point of the battle. French soldiers across the battlefield had been told the Imperial Guard would win the day, that Napoleon's elite would smash through British lines and achieve victory. When they saw the Guard retreating, when the cry, "La Garde recule," spread through French ranks, morale collapsed. Soldiers who might have continued fighting lost hope. If the Imperial Guard couldn't break British lines, nothing could. The subsequent French rout was as much psychological as physical. British infantry advanced from their positions, maintaining formation and delivering volleys into retreating French forces. But they didn't need to pursue far. The French army was breaking apart on its own, dissolving into a mob of men desperate to escape. The aftermath of Waterloo saw British infantry occupying the battlefield they had defended. The ground was carpeted with dead and wounded from both sides. The concentrations of casualties marked where fighting had been most intense, where French columns had pressed against British lines. British soldiers, exhausted beyond description, began the grim work of helping wounded comrades and searching for missing friends. The euphoria of victory was tempered by awareness of the cost. Battalions that had started the day with 500 men counted 200 or fewer still standing. Officers and sergeants who had led companies were dead or wounded. Yet the fundamental units, the battalions and regiments, had held together. British military organisation had proven resilient enough to maintain cohesion even after suffering terrible casualties. The strategic consequences of Waterloo were immense. Napoleon's defeat ended his political career permanently. The French threat to European stability was eliminated. Britain emerged as the dominant military power in Europe, a position it would hold throughout the 19th century. But at the tactical level, Waterloo vindicated the system of linear infantry tactics that Britain had developed over decades. The thin red line had proven that disciplined firepower could defeat mass and momentum. 2 ranks of well-trained infantry with muskets were more effective than 9 ranks of enthusiastic troops in columns. This lesson influenced military thinking throughout the century that followed, though its applicability would be challenged by technological changes that made all massed infantry formations increasingly vulnerable. For the men who fought at Waterloo, the battle was the defining experience of their lives. Soldiers who survived carried physical and psychological scars for decades. Many suffered from what we would now recognise as post-traumatic stress, though Victorian society had no such concept. They had nightmares about the battle, were startled by loud noises, struggled with the memories of comrades dying beside them, but they also had pride in what they had accomplished. They had stood in their ranks under the worst conditions imaginable and done their duty. They had maintained discipline when every instinct screamed to run. They had delivered the volleys that broke French columns and won the battle. This was an accomplishment they could take pride in for the rest of their lives, even as they struggled with its psychological costs. The legacy of Waterloo and British linear tactics extended far beyond 1815. The thin red line became an iconic image of British military power, referenced in countless histories, paintings, and popular accounts. British infantry maintained their 2-rank line formation and emphasis on volley fire throughout the 19th century, using these tactics in colonial conflicts around the world. The underlying principle, that disciplined, coordinated firepower was more effective than individual marksmanship or shocking charges, remained central to British military doctrine for decades. Only when technological changes, particularly breech-loading rifles and machine guns, fundamentally altered battlefield dynamics did the thin red line finally become obsolete. But in its time, from the Peninsula to Waterloo, it was the most effective infantry tactical system in the world, proven through countless battles where British firepower broke enemy formations. The thunder of British volleys was the sound of that effectiveness, a mechanical precision that transformed disciplined soldiers into instruments of destruction and won battles through accumulated mathematics of lead and gunpowder.